12th of April 2024, 1800 hours BST. It's an ordinary Friday in Croydon, the sort of afternoon where nothing remarkable happens apart from the normal buzz of upcoming football games and mates catching up after a long week. Surrey Street Market is winding down as vendors pack away their stalls, and the scent of street food fades into the evening air. People are drifting toward the pubs as they do. Weekend rituals, familiar faces, and the everyday rhythm of South London life. And then three men walk into the Spread Eagle pub. They're not in a rush and do not glance over their shoulders. There's clearly no tension in their stride and no urgency in their movements. They settle in like any other punters on any other Saturday, relaxed and unremarkable. To anyone else, they seemed completely and utterly normal. Yet just minutes before entering the pub, these same men were involved in something unspeakable. In a narrow alleyway barely a few hundred meters away, someone lay dying, and the people responsible did not flee or even panic. Rather, they simply walked into a pub. This is utterly chilling because when we imagine violence, we also imagine what comes after. From the getaway to the fear, and even the desperate attempts to escape consequences. It's practically hardwired into us, and that's how guilt manifests in almost every murder case. But what happens when that script is torn up entirely, and in its place, an unexpected plot twist occurs? What happens when the aftermath looks nothing like panic and everything like indifference? This case is about to deconstruct everything you think you know about how people behave after committing murder, because in British criminal law, there is a concept that does not get nearly enough tension outside courtrooms. It's called post-offense conduct, and in this investigation, it would prove more damning than almost anything else. You see, juries are asked to consider not just what happened during a crime, but what happened immediately after it. How did the accused behave? Did they seek help? Did they show remorse? Did they act like someone who had just experienced a terrifying loss of control? Or did they act like someone who knew exactly what they had done and simply did not show an ounce of care in the world? The men who walked into that pub in the evening of the 12th of April 2024 gave investigators a masterclass in incriminating behavior, not because they confessed to their crimes or even left a trail of physical evidence, but because they behaved as though nothing had happened at all. And that's the paradox at the heart of this entire case. Most criminals make mistakes because they panic. Ironically, these men made their fatal mistake by not panicking. They stayed together, crossed the street calmly, entered a public space filled with witnesses, ordered drinks, presumably, and simply exited in plain sight, as if a young man was not bleeding out in an alley just streets away. For anyone watching the CCTV footage later, and there would be hours upon hours of it, the reaction is visceral and triggers only one question. How can you take a life and then just carry on like nothing happened? It is at this point that criminal psychology meets hard legal evidence, because that calmness and refusal to scatter or hide does not read as innocence. Far from it. It reads as control. These men betrayed nothing, and that eerie void where panic should have been would turn out to be one of the most powerful pieces of evidence the prosecution had. This was not a fight that spiraled out of control or a spur-of-the-moment tragedy. It was something else entirely. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we can understand why that pub footage mattered so much, and even before we can grasp the full weight of what investigators uncovered, we need to rewind and go back to the beginning of that fateful April day. We need to understand who these men were, what they were doing in Croydon, and most critically, what they were looking for. Because this case is not solved in a pub or in the alley where the attack happened. Instead, it's solved across an entire day. Every movement, decision, and fragment of CCTV footage is stitched together into an undeniable timeline. What to investigators would be evidence of something far more chilling: premeditation, precise planning, and a coordinated effort that turned a summer evening in London into something families will never recover from. The violence itself might have lasted less than a minute, but what came before it and what came after is simply what would seal the fate of everyone involved. And it all starts with a young man named Rikard Siafa, 22 years old, stepping out of a flat on Fellmonger's yard, heading to meet someone he cared about. He had no idea he was walking into the final moments of his life. Friday the 12th of April 2024, 5:30 in the evening. It's that in-between hour where the day has not quite finished, but the evening has not properly begun. And in a flat accessed through a narrow passage called Fellmunger's Yard, a 22-year-old man named Rikard Siafa is getting ready to leave. He's heading out to meet his girlfriend. Needless to say, these are ordinary plans, the kind you don't think twice about, plans that on any other evening would be entirely forgettable. He steps out into the alleyway. It's tight and barely wide enough for two people to pass comfortably. Brick walls on either side, the sort of shortcut locals use without thinking. He makes his way toward the junction with Surrey Street, where the passage opens onto the main road. And then something happens, and the CCTV cameras positioned at the junction capture it. Rikard reaches the opening. He's just about to step out onto Surrey Street, but he stops. He seems to hesitate. It's the briefest moment, maybe a second or two, but it's enough. He has seen something, or someone, and whatever it is, it triggers an immediate reaction. He turns and starts to run back into Fellmunger's Yard. Within seconds, 3 men appear at the junction. They don't hesitate or call out. They don't even try to recon him and get him to stop him with words. Instead, they chase. And as they reach the entrance to the alley, the cameras capture something that transforms this from a pursuit into something far darker. 2 of the men reach forward from their waistbands. The movement is deliberate and practiced. And when their hands come back up, they're holding knives. Then they disappear into Fellmunger's Yard after him. But the camera's scope of view can only be so wide, and this actually becomes a significant part of this story. The reason for this is what happens next takes place almost entirely off camera, and that absence matters more than you might think. The thing is, in many murder trials, juries are shown graphic footage, violence captured in brutal detail. As much as it's harrowing, it often becomes the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. But this case would never rely on that, because the cameras could not see into Fellmunger's Yard. The violence happened in shadow. So how do you prove a murder when you cannot show the murder itself? You prove it with everything around it. The geography, the timing, the movements before and after, the corroboration. You build a case not on what was seen, but on what can be reliably inferred. And the geography of Fellmunger's Yard tells its own story. It's narrow and barely a few meters across. There are high walls on both sides and no windows overlooking it. And most importantly, there is no through route. It's a dead end. Once you're inside, there's only one way out, the same way you came in. So from a tactical perspective, if you're chasing someone, that geography is devastatingly effective. It removes options, compresses space, and eliminates the possibility of escape. Sadly, for someone being pursued by 3 armed men, it becomes a rather catastrophic trap. The attack itself lasts less than a minute, possibly as little as 20 seconds from start to finish. Rikard Siafa was stabbed 13 times. The CCTV at the junction picks the 3 men up again as they re-emerge from Fellmunger's Yard, still calm and composed. It's chilling observing them as they don't run or look panicked. They don't even scatter in different directions, as you might expect people to do after committing an act of extreme violence. Instead, they leave as a unit. Behind them, in that enclosed passageway, Siafa lies critically injured, alone and bleeding out in an alley where nobody can see him. Members of the public would find him moments later. They tried to help by administering first aid as best they could while waiting for emergency services. London's air ambulance would later arrive, and paramedics would do everything possible, but the damage was catastrophic. Siafa would be pronounced dead at the scene 30 minutes later at 18:28 BST. Meanwhile, the 3 men who had just killed him were crossing the road toward a pub. And this is where our expectations about violence collide with reality in the most unsettling way. These men were not behaving as though they had just done something that would haunt them. Shockingly, they behaved as though they had completed an important task, one that called for them to walk into a pub and down a few pints. The CCTV follows them across Surrey Street as they walk without glancing over their shoulders. They enter the Spread Eagle pub on Catherine Street, order 3 pints of Guinness, and pay with a £20 note. They are then asked to remove their hats, house rules, and they comply. They then find their seats, proceed to drink their beer, and simply exist in a space filled with ordinary people having ordinary evenings. At 18:04, just minutes after the attack, the three men get up and leave without finishing their drinks. By this time, just streets away, emergency services are still fighting to save Siafa's life. The juxtaposition is staggering, unbearable to say the least. But in a courtroom, that juxtaposition becomes something more complex. It becomes evidence, because such calm and organized behavior after an act of extreme violence does not support a defense of diminished responsibility or spontaneous rage. It suggests the suspects knew exactly what they were doing, and they simply did not think twice about the repercussions and chose to go ahead and complete it. Now we arrive at the part of this case that will fundamentally challenge your understanding of how murder investigations work, because there is a critical fact about criminal law that most people don't realize. Sometimes, what happens after a crime is just as incriminating as the crime itself. The three men who emerged from Fellmonger's yard that Friday evening were 35-year-old David Walcott, 33-year-old Ramon Malley, and a third man, Jordan Vincent, still wanted by police. Yet after committing such a heinous act, they did not seem interested in covering it up. They even made no attempts to blend into the crowd or vanish into the urban sprawl of South London. They walked, casually, like mates heading for a quiet pint. They crossed Surrey Street, and the CCTV cameras tracked them the entire way. Every step, turn, and moment of chilling composure was being documented, all these unknown to them. When they entered the Spread Eagle pub, nothing about their demeanor suggested they had just cut someone else's life short. They were even compliant to the house rules and did not seem interested in challenging them in any way. To the ordinary eye, these were just ordinary blokes looking to wind down after a busy day. To think that you had just stabbed someone 13 times, left them dying in an alleyway, and you are now calmly enjoying a glass of Guinness and following pub etiquette is just as chilling and disturbing as it gets. In fact, to investigators, it's that disconnect, that absolute void where panic should exist, that makes this case so profoundly dark. But this aspect triggers a situation where the legal framework becomes critical. In British criminal law, there's a concept called post-offence conduct. It's not about proving what happened during the crime, rather, focus shifts, and it now becomes all about proving what was going on in the defendant's mind when it happened. When someone kills in genuine panic, perhaps in a moment of unplanned rage, or in self-defense that spirals out of control, they typically show immediate signs of distress afterwards. They openly exhibit shock, horror, and the physical manifestation of psychological trauma. But controlled and deliberate behavior after an act of extreme violence tells a completely different story. It suggests that the killing was not reactive. Far from it. It points toward a conclusion that it was not spontaneous, but intentional. And that distinction is everything in a murder trial. The prosecution would later argue that the calm demeanor demonstrated by Walcott and Marley after the attack was fundamentally inconsistent with any claim of loss of control. You can't argue you acted in panic if you were ordering Guinness minutes later. The jury would eventually see this footage, and the reaction from those 12 ordinary people like you and me, was instinctual. Questions lingered in the air. How can someone do this? How can they behave as though a human life hasn't just been violently extinguished? But that emotional response is exactly what makes the evidence so legally powerful, because the behavior does not just feel wrong by miles, it is wrong, and it allows the jury to infer consciousness of guilt, premeditation, and control. And it is right at that point that the investigation truly opened up, because detectives did not just focus on what happened after the murder. They knew if they were to get to the root of this murder, it was now time to widen their lens to examine the entire day. Every movement, interaction, and moment these men were captured on camera. Nothing was to be overlooked now. And just as expected, what they found was deeply troubling. Hours before the attack, Walcott and Marley were spotted together in Croydon. They were not shopping or socializing, they were engaged in something far chilling. According to Detective Chief Inspector Samantha Townsend, the two young men had been actively looking for Siafa during the afternoon of Friday 12th of April 2024. They were searching, circulating, and positioning themselves near Surrey Street Market, near Fellmonger's yard. They seemed to be fully aware of Siafa's whereabouts. The prosecution would describe this behavior as predatory, and when you watch the footage in sequence, from the hours of circling, the convergence on a specific location, and the pursuit when they finally spotted their target, It's difficult to interpret it any other way. But that's not all. There is another layer to this that makes it even more damning. The geography. Fellmonger's Yard is not just the location where the murder happened, it's evidence in itself. Do you remember how we painted the picture of this place? It's narrow, enclosed, high walls on both sides, and critically, no exit. It's literally a dead end. When you pursue someone into that kind of space, you're not reacting to a spontaneous confrontation. You're making a tactical choice, a premeditated one. You're creating a scenario where the victim has nowhere to go, where their options collapse, and where control shifts entirely to the pursuers. From a legal perspective, that transforms the nature of what follows. It's no longer reactive violence, it's deliberate, strategic, and calculated to the very last minute. The alley did not simply host the offense, instead, it shaped it, defined it, and most importantly, demonstrated sheer intent. Judge Anujadir KC would later describe it as a planned, quick, and brutal premeditated killing committed by 3 armed men against 1 unarmed victim in a public place. Everything about this case pointed to one conclusion. This was not a fight that got out of hand. This was hunting, and Siafa was the prey. Within an hour following Siafa's passing, a murder investigation was formally declared. It was given a designation, Operation Biscuit, and from that moment, every resource available to the Metropolitan Police's Specialist Crime Command was mobilized. One thing that makes modern murder investigations like this so fascinating and so different from what most people imagine is that detectives did not start with names. Instead, they set their sights first on movement. They took the clearest images they had. These included footage from the entrance to Fellmonger's Yard, showing 3 men entering and exiting. With these at hand, they began working in 2 directions simultaneously, backwards to establish how these individuals arrived at that location, and forwards to trace every single step they took after leaving the scene. This is where the real detective work begins, not with dramatic confrontations or witness interrogations, but with hours upon hours of painstaking methodical CCTV analysis. The investigation team would eventually review more than 100 hours of camera footage. And that's just the viewing time. The actual process of obtaining, cataloging, and cross-referencing that footage took exponentially longer. The team started with council-operated cameras on Surrey Street and the surrounding roads. This is the standard CCTV infrastructure that covers main thoroughfares throughout London. After exhausting that, they widened the net and started looking into private business security cameras. They also obtained footage from residential doorbell systems, the ring cameras and nests that so many people now have mounted outside their homes. They also viewed Transport for London footage from bus stops and tram stations, petrol station forecourts, and shop fronts. They went through every lens that might have captured even a fragment of movement through Croydon that afternoon and evening. Each camera provides only a glimpse, a direction of travel, a timestamp, as well as a brief appearance lasting seconds. But when it's put together, those fragments begin to form something extraordinary. The team now gets a continuous timeline. They have on their hands a digital trail that follows individuals across hours and miles with remarkable precision. And what that timeline revealed about the 3 men at the center of Siafa's murder was chilling. The footage revealed that after leaving the Spread Eagle pub, the men continued moving through Croydon. All this time they were still together, still calm, and still showing no visible signs of panic or urgency. The cameras then tracked them back toward residential areas. They entered apartment buildings and were out of the scope for some time. And then something significant happened. When they re-emerged, their appearance had changed. Clothing was different and the outer layers that had been visible earlier were no longer there. They had removed specific items worn during the attack. Now here's the legal nuance that matters. Changing your clothes is not a crime. People change clothes all the time for perfectly innocent reasons. But context is everything. When someone changes their clothing immediately after committing a violent offense, particularly when the items removed are never recovered, that behavior takes on a different meaning entirely. It's a strong suggestion of awareness. Investigators translated as an understanding that what was worn earlier might now carry forensic consequences, such as blood spatter, DNA, or any other form of physical evidence linking them to the scene. Back to the 3 men, the timeline continued. The cameras showed the men leaving separately this time. This time their routes diverged as each carried away items from the address in bags. Later on, those specific articles of clothing were never found. Despite extensive searches where forensic teams examined bins and drainage systems throughout the area, the garments worn during the attack simply vanished. In legal terms, this is what's known as consciousness of guilt. These are specific steps taken by people who understand the seriousness of what has occurred and are attempting to distance themselves from it. No single action proves guilt on its own. The law recognizes that people behave differently under stress. But when those actions form a pattern and align precisely with a timeline that shows premeditation, execution, and cover-up, they become devastating evidence. Yet you might ask, what now? Now that at no point did the cameras actually capture the fatal moment itself. It's true that the violence in Fellmonger's Yard occurred entirely out of view. There was no graphic imagery or footage of the attack, and nothing shows the acts of killing. Despite that crucial missing part, the case did not suffer from that absence, because the evidence around that moment was so comprehensive and tightly corroborated that what was not seen could be reliably inferred. Witnesses would later describe hearing shouting, movement, and sounds consistent with a violent struggle, and all these further reaffirmed the findings of the investigating team. Emergency service records also documented the precise timeline of the response from the 999 calls, the arrival of police, ambulance crews, and London's air ambulance, and attempts to save Siafa's life. Pathology reports detailed the injuries with clinical precision, the 13 stab wounds, the trajectory of each blade, and the cause of death, and all of it aligned perfectly with the CCTV timeline. The inference was not speculation, it was solid and foolproof evidence. This was the type of evidence built not on spectacle, but on the sheer accumulation of verifiable facts. Within days, investigators had identified both David Walcott and Ramon Malley. A manhunt was launched. Walcott was tracked to an address in Streatham and arrested on the 19th of April, exactly 1 week after the murder. The case of Malley, however, would start on a complicated note. It soon became apparent that he had fled the country. Records showed he left the country on Tuesday the 16th of April, that being just 4 days after killing Siafa. But when he returned to the UK on the 5th of May, he was arrested at Gatwick Airport. Both men were charged with murder, and when their case went to trial, the jury would see everything. We're talking about over 100 hours of footage, the timeline, the behavior, and the entire pattern. They would simply not need to witness the violence to understand exactly what had happened. The jury then moved to consider the legal framework, the requirements for murder, the concept of joint enterprise, and the significance of post-offense conduct. And after reviewing everything, their decision was unanimous. Guilty of murder, both defendants. Eventually, on the 17th of January 2025, Judge Anujadir KC handed down the sentences at the Old Bailey. In English law, murder carries a mandatory life sentence. The judge's role is not to decide if someone serves life, but to set the minimum term. That's essentially the earliest point at which parole can even be considered. For murders involving knives brought to the scene, the sentencing guidelines start at 25 years. But that's just the baseline. Aggravating factors such as planning, premeditation, victims' vulnerability, the public nature of the offense, and coordination between multiple offenders increase that term substantially. David Walcott, then 35 years old, received life imprisonment with a minimum term of 27 years. Ramon Malley, 33 at the time, received the same term, minimum 27 years. That means they will not even be considered for release until they're in their 60s. And consideration does not guarantee release. In fact, many lifers never leave prison. Vincent Jordan remains wanted by police. His face has been circulated, and the manhunt continues to date. Today, if you walk through Croydon, Fellmonger's Yard is still quiet, narrow, and enclosed. Surrey Street Market still closes at the end of each day, and the Spread Eagle pub still opens for business. Life continues, and the city seems to have moved on from that shocking murder. But what Walcott and Malley fundamentally miscalculated was that acting normal would protect them. They thought that by not panicking, walking calmly, ordering drinks, and following pub etiquette, they could blend back into ordinary life. They thought the absence of fear would suggest innocence. What they failed to understand is that cities remember. London in particular remembers everything. Every camera, lens, and digital eye positioned on street corners and shop fronts and residential doorways does not miss anything. And when investigators begin connecting those fragments, they form something undeniable. The most powerful evidence in this case was not found in moments of violence. It was found in what came afterwards. What these men did when they genuinely believed nobody was watching. And that's the reality of modern crime solving. Not through spectacle or confession, but through the relentless accumulation of verifiable facts, CCTV footage, witness testimony, forensic pathology, digital footprint, and movement patterns. Each element on its own might seem small, but together they tell a story that juries can trust and the law can test. If you're interested in more content similar to this, then this channel should be on your subscriptions list, as it exists just for that. So consider subscribing so you don't miss future updates, and see you in the next one.